Winston Churchill is often attributed with saying something along the lines of, if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 30, you have no head. I guess I never had a heart, but I've always had a head. When I first became interested in politics as a teenager, I knew I was not a leftist. I grew up in a working class family in 3 working class suburbs in the north of Melbourne. Even in the 1970s and 80s it was multicultural. Australians, Italians, Greeks, Yugoslavs and Turks, and at school there was some Lebanese. The smallest street I lived on had only 6 houses in it. Greeks, Australians, an Italian husband and English wife, Australians, Yugoslavs and Italians. The only Asians were at the Chinese restaurant, and the darkest people I knew were Greeks, some of whom looked Indian more than European. Violence was rare, and crime was primarily property crime, although property crime was quite high. People lived side by side and shopped at the same shops and were friendly in the street, but at the same time each socialised in their own clubs and churches. The Turks, I should add, were very secular. I didn't even know they were Muslim until I was a teenager. At school there were ethnic tensions, but often between other ethnic groups, but in hindsight rarely did it amount to much. I first came to know about politics in the early 1980s, during what historians now call the Second Cold War, when tensions were high between the West and the communist world. I knew we had enemies, and I knew that some people in my country gave much aid and comfort to those enemies. A big controversy at the time were nuclear weapons. I always wondered why they protested American nuclear weapons, but never the Soviet or Chinese ones. I also wondered why the media always showed the anti-Vietnam War protesters as the good guys. What became clear to me was that they had picked a side, and it wasn't my country's side. It wasn't my side either. I knew from an early age that I was a patriot, and living amongst other ethnic groups, I also knew I was Australian, that I wasn't Greek or Italian or any other nationality, and I learnt at an early age that they weren't Australian. Don't get me wrong, I didn't hate any of these people. As I said earlier, they were in the main friendly and good people, but they weren't my people. They were foreign people who lived in my country. Around the same time, I saw something happen that was quite strange. Many of the Greeks, Yugoslavs, etc., who worked with my stepfather had enough money to return home. In most cases, they hadn't been home in decades. Before they left, they were very strongly Greek or Yugoslav, but when they came back, their attitude had changed completely. When they came back, they started calling themselves Australians. They had found out that their homeland had changed, just as everything else had, that the things they didn't like about Australia were often the same or worse back in the old country, and that the life they had here was much better than the life they could have had if they had stayed. This change in attitude helped a great deal as they assimilated. But the Australian government wasn't happy with that. No, they wanted more immigration, and from more countries. The reason so many people point to Australia as a multicultural success story was because most of the immigrants were European, and in time they assimilated. Starting in the 1970s, the Australian government has decided to bring in primarily non-European immigrants and to encourage them not to assimilate, while at the same time having a large unemployment problem. Nearly all the current problems with immigration can be traced back to this starting point. So from as early as I can remember, I was interested in politics. I knew I wasn't on the left. That must mean I was a conservative, and I probably would have called myself such, although now that I look back on it, I also had a lot of classical liberal ideals. On the right side, I was a monarchist, made much easier by being born in a constitutional monarchy. I was always sceptical of feminism. I've always thought that a woman's highest calling was as a wife and mother, that being an accountant was more important always seemed wrong to me. But I also had a number of classical liberal ideals. I was a civic patriot. I was seduced by the idea of equality. I knew I didn't support communism or socialism, so I thought free trade might be the answer. And while I was never a crusader, I accepted global warming. Last, and now I realise the worst, was that at the back of my mind was the idea that one day there would be a perfect society. I admit it's such a compelling idea that what you believe might one day result in perfection, but it's also at one and the same time a stupid idea, because common sense and your own personal experience should tell you that such a thing is simply not possible. What I find interesting is that I could see that in the ideas of others, but not that it also lurked in me as well. Although I was never a Liberal Party supporter, I remember seeing a very small article in the newspaper sometime around 1985. It was about the Victorian State Conference, who had voted that they wanted capital punishment brought back, but not a single Liberal member of Parliament would support it. Even as a teenager, I saw that the Liberal Party didn't represent its members, and if it didn't represent them, it sure didn't support anyone who wasn't a member. My first real taste of reality was when I left school, as for most of us. Unemployment awaited me, as it did for so many others. No job, no hope of a job, no woman. The truth is that a man needs a job to hold on to a woman. He needs money. He needs hope. He needs a future. But for the working class men of my generation, we face the twin challenge of immigrants getting lower down jobs and women getting the higher up jobs. It would be a rare man who has not had a period of unemployment, and with unemployment comes hopelessness and loneliness and poverty. For some, that poverty is much more than a lack of money. I was lucky as I never went that low. I had jobs and unemployment, and I went as an adult to university to get a degree, and that taught me a lot, kept me busy, but that never helped. That is this generation's burden, the worthless degree. I had a long-term relationship that ended many years ago. I've had my share of ups and downs, but I kept quite close to what I had always believed. Over time, I got sick of the constant lies I kept hearing, that we needed more immigration because it helped the economy, but it wasn't helping me, and I didn't see it helping anyone else in the unemployment line. That the real problem with multiculturalism was that whites were racist, that we were not tolerant. Hold on, 1/3 of Australia's population was born overseas, and we aren't tolerant? You would have to be a complete moron to believe that. Sadly, we have many more complete morons that we really require. It's also a bit much to be constantly told how discriminated against women and immigrants are when they get the job that you require. And this keeps happening, decade after decade. Until 2006, I accepted global warming without really thinking about it. And one day my mother is watching the news and she says, "Another story on global warming." And to my surprise, I replied, "It's probably not even true." After that, I started to think about it. And I remember all the horror stories we were told when global warming first started being talked about and how that time was now. But the oceans hadn't risen. The polar bears weren't extinct. In short, they lied. In 2010, I was very upset about the direction Australia was heading. So I decided to look on the internet to find some kindred spirit. I found Oz Conservative and contacted Mr. Richardson, and we met up. Since then, we've stayed in contact and see each other a few times a year, first with the Eltham Traditionalist, and now with the Melbourne Traditionalist. But as I read more of his site, I realised I had things I wanted to say, and he was very supportive. He told me that one thing that would happen was that I would do a lot of thinking, and that it would really clear up my thinking. I was sceptical, but he was right. My thinking is much clearer. Things I had only vaguely thought about, I had to deeply think about. I had to make sure that the things I wrote made sense to both me and to others. In doing that, I came to understand liberalism a lot more, and I came to understand the right. I realised what they had in common and where they differed. I finally ended most of my classical liberal ways. I won't say all, as we're all bathed in liberalism from birth. So have I always been a traditionalist? The answer is no, but I am now.